While Israel's 75th Independence Day is a moment of great celebration, it is also a time to reflect on the dreams of the past and the realities they have become. This is especially true because this year's celebration takes place at a critical time, with the country caught in the grip of bitterly compromising views of what Israel's earlier promises were, and what has evolved of arguments and protest over what Israeli democracy means and where the country is headed. Ironically, long before the current crisis, Dr. Daniel Gordis was wrestling with such questions for his new book, Impossible Takes Longer, asking what the goals of Israel's founders really were, what sort of a country, what sort of a democracy they envisioned, and how Israel 2023 measures up. We are extremely honored that he returns to the Streicker Center tonight to discuss the conclusions he drew before Israel's political divisions exploded, and how his views have or have not changed over these past challenging few months, and what he is celebrating as Israel turns 75. As I suspect most of you know, Dr. Gordis, who made Aliyah from California 25 years ago. By the way, he was the dean of students when I went to undergraduate. Don't ask him about it, but you can ask me if you want. He's the author of 8 books and the Koret Distinguished Fellow at Jerusalem Shalem College, which he helped found. He will be in conversation with our friend, writer, journalist, and podcast host, Abigail Pogrebin, and he will be taking questions from the audience. When times for questions come, if you have a question, raise your hand. A staff member will walk around with a microphone and you can ask your question. Please don't give a speech, ask a question. And the last thing I want to mention, we have 2 great events coming up this week. Tomorrow night, we have a special film called Eichmann, The Lost Tapes. As you know, in the Eichmann trial, 1961, he kept insisting that he didn't know anything, that he had no intention, he was just following orders. This was his defense. The Mossad was not aware of those tapes. Those tapes did not come out after the trial, but in those tapes he's interviewed for an Argentinian reporter, and he talks about what he really knew, what he really felt, and it is a fascinating film. We're going to screen the film in its entirety tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, and then we'll have a conversation with a Holocaust expert and the director of the film. On Friday night, we will be celebrating Israel at 75 with Achinoam Nini and Gil Dor at 6 o'clock. I hope you will join us for both. If you can, we'll love to see you again. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Please buy a book and get it signed. And at this time, please welcome Daniel Gordis and Abigail Pogrebin. Thank you. Please welcome Daniel Gordis and Abigail Pogrebin.
Talk about an anticlimax. Hello, everyone. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Abby.
This is going to be a very tough interview.
Good.
Before we get to the book, which is quite amazing, let's talk about this moment, because I'm sure many people who are watching, there's 2,000 people watching, in addition to all of you who intrepid folks who are here in person. Help us put in perspective, because there's news obviously every day that changes the facts on the ground and our spilkus. How do you diagnose kind of where we are right now in the tumult?
I'm actually going to take this out. I'm going to try to take this out. There we go. We're in a halftime pause, but we're in a very, very dangerous place. We're in a dangerous place, first of all, because the judicial reform as proposed is very, very, very undermining of Israel's democratic qualities. If it were passed the way it was originally proposed, which it won't be, then we would be talking about an either illiberal democracy or a non-democracy. So there's that danger. There's a grave danger, I think, of violence in the next few weeks, few months. The protests, even now, with the Knesset on recess, are still drawing 140,000 people on Saturday nights in Tel Aviv. And once the Knesset's recess is over, I believe on May 8th, and the legislative push in some form, unless Bibi can pull it back, which is another question altogether, continues, the protests will only grow. With hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets and a very, very angry, it's not really right-left, and tonight we have to try to stay away from right-left because it's really not about that. Right-left tends to come up when we're talking about foreign policy. This is it's not about Arabs, it's not even about economic policy. It's about two very different conceptions of what kind of a country Israel should be.
And before you leave the violence point, you have said on your podcast that you've been so energized, kind of comforted, inspired by the fact that there has been no violence, that it really has been incredibly peaceful considering the hordes that are in the street. So why are you saying now this could actually turn?
Well, I think the right, which again is not the right term, but the people that want to push through the judicial reform are feeling, again, this is me trying to express what they think. They say, look, we won the election. You may have mismanaged the election and Labor should have run with merits, and it's true if Labor had run with merits, then you might not have been out. But you're in the opposition. We won the election. We were not keeping a secret what we intended to do. You're just sore losers. And what you're doing is anti-democratic. We won the election. It's our legislative agenda. By virtue of what? Do you block highways and pilots don't report for duty? And, they say high-tech people are pulling billions of dollars out of the country. There's a tremendous amount of anger on both sides. And with a couple 100,000 people in Kaplan Square on Tel Aviv on a Saturday night, it takes just one crazy person to do one crazy thing, and police can't protect 200,000 people. So I think there's a tremendous amount of anger. We'll come back to it, I'm sure, but I think that in terms of where are we at this moment, even if judicial reform were to completely get put to bed now, the genie is out of the bottle. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Israel is a country now really kind of awash in hate, and we can talk about what that hate is and between whom, but it's a sea of hate. The last time there was rhetoric like this in Israel, it was 1995, and we ended up burying Yitzhak Rabin.
So you said, again, on your most recent podcast, something has been unleashed that is not going away. Is hate what you're talking about, or is it this sense of actual more unity about the outrage, if that makes sense, that there's more commonality of discomfort here?
Well, I think what's been unleashed is that there are at least two, perhaps more, very, very different conceptions of the kind of country that Israel should be. And if you want to just put it, very, very succinctly and a little bit too oversimplified, the highly secular founders of Israel 75 years ago believed that what they were going to do was create a country that was going to save the Jewish people from the Jewish religion. The Jewish religion had turned the Jew in Europe to passive and afraid and weak and et cetera, and we were going to reinvent the Jew. That was what Israel was really all about. Everybody here knows about this notion of the new Jew, the chalutz, the pioneer back in the day, the kibbutznik back in the day, and those are all things of past. What we've discovered is two things. Number one is that people have needs. They need food, they need water, they need air, they need companionship. They also very often need some spiritual sense of connection. And in Israel, what's been bubbling back to the surface is a connection to Jewish roots, which is coming largely through the Mizrahi world culturally and so forth. But there's also been a rise of a kind of Judaism that we had never seen before, which is an ethno-nationalist, often racist version of Judaism. I don't think it is the Judaism of a significant number of people in Israel, but it's the Judaism of a high-profile group of people in Israel. And so what I think we're awash in is people that care about Israel's liberal democratic qualities and are happy with it being secular. There are people who want it to be overtly Jewish in the public square and less secular and more open to the underclass, which is the Mizrahim as they see themselves. Now, as we see in the news just today and yesterday, there's also the Haredim, who are a third piece here, who are now about to maybe get legislation passed that would essentially make non-drafting of Haredim the law of the land forever, and at a much younger age, which means that the pretense that they're in yeshiva is a gone pretense. It used to be, well, they're in yeshiva learning till they're 26 or 27. You're not going to draft them at that age. So after they've been in yeshiva all those years, we're not going to draft them. But now they're saying 21, 23. In other words, the pretense is over. We just don't want to go to the army because we don't go into the army. And that's a huge that's a huge dent in the notion of the People's Army. So there's lots of different visions. They're all passionately held. None of them are anti-Israel. They're all in love with the Jewish state in different kinds of ways. The Haredim less, but certainly the protesters on both sides.
You have pointed out that it's very significant that the Israeli flag is being flown. That is not something we should underestimate.
It was a huge, brilliant move on the part of the protesters. First of all, we should understand, we take it now for granted all these protesters are protesting. The government assumed that there would be no protests, or that if there were protests, they'd come out for one Saturday night, and then they'd get cold, because it was cold at the beginning. And
rainy.
What's that?
There was night where there was rain on, whatever.
There was rain, it was cold. My wife and I went to the protest.
Jews in the rain.
We don't like it. You get wet. So, my wife and I actually would go to the protests in Jerusalem. We'd be all bundled up, wearing parkas and gloves and scarves and wool hats. And then invariably, Elisheva would say to me, "Take off your hat." And I'd say, "It's freezing." And she would say, not incorrectly, "People need to see that there's kippot here also." So the hat would come off, and I would just get frostbite on my ears. It's all good. But I think that there's a sense here that it's really...
But the flag.
Right. And so there's a sense here that this is about an explosion of love. That's how I would describe where we are. We are an explosion of love. People expected these hundreds of thousands of high-tech yuppies, oversimplified, but more or less, expected them to protest very kind of anemically and then say, okay, whatever. But it's been the exact opposite. They are much more in love with the project called the Jewish state than anybody imagined. They're not going anywhere.
And you're no yuppie.
And I think I...
But I actually want to say something serious about that. The fact that Daniel Gordis is in the street when those of us who have watched and read you for so long kind of put you in a certain place on the spectrum of ideology. We can talk about that. But I want to just talk about your AIPAC speech, which is not available, right? It was not recorded or broadcast, but there was press about it in the Jewish Insider, and that you surprised people. You were like the keynote, the final speech, and the headline in the Jewish Insider was Daniel Gordis's blunt message at AIPAC's confab. This was in January, before even these protests really took flight. And the reporter said, it feels like it was almost a departure from what you've said in the past. This was her talking to you, like it shifted the tone of the room. And you answered, what I wanted them to hear was, from an Israeli, this is serious. This is hard. This is scary. Some of us are worried and some of us are panicked. And by the way, it's not only left or right. I mean, there's Israeli Likud voters who are unhappy with what's going on. In other words, it's falling to a certain extent on political lines, but it's not falling on political lines. I wanted them to understand that it's okay to be very concerned about what's going on. Can you just talk about whether you have felt like you're in a place that's surprising people personally?
I think I am. I'm not quite sure why it's surprising, but yeah, I think first of all, at the AIPAC event, which didn't officially happen, but there are, it's like Israel's nuclear weapons. We don't deny or confirm, but this was all starting, and there's this sense in parts of the Jewish community that what we do is we applaud the Israeli prime minister enthusiastically, and we give him or her, but nowadays him, a standing ovation, and it felt to me like very much the wrong thing to do. Like it felt to me immoral to give Bibi Netanyahu a standing ovation, because by appointing Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Maoz, who now were yesterday's news, but back in the day, they were appalling to many of us, and unleashing this judicial reform. By the way, I believe that judicial reform is needed, just not this judicial reform. Mm-hmm. There's a time that being pro-Israel and loving Israel means that you actually tell the prime minister what you're doing is wrong. And I think there are groups in America, and I'm not speaking just about AIPAC, there are lots of groups in America who that's not part of their toolbox. Their toolbox does not include the ability to look at the head of state and say, we love your country and we hate what you're doing. Now, very often that toolbox has been honed because it's been about Israel's conflict with the Palestinians or Israel at war with Gaza or whatever the case may be. So they feel the need to defend Israel. But this, again, is not pro-Israel or anti-Israel. This is about pro a certain kind of Israel or pro a very different kind of Israel. And I was very frank with people. I spoke at the end of the conference, as you said, and they had already met with Bibi over satellite, and they had given him a standing ovation. And I have to say, I was kind of dumbfounded, and I was kind of like punched in the stomach. And I remember it was too late in Israel to write anybody, but my daughter lives in Boston. And I wrote her a WhatsApp, and I said, I got to go on stage in a little while, and this is, and she wrote me back, my daughter trying to calm me down, and she said, look, what they did was terrible, but remember, they did it out of the best of intentions, which is, of course, both true. But I think that giving support to this particular government about those particular appointees and this particular program is wrong. And I said so. And it's got nothing to do with being Likud or Labor or anything of the sort. It's about turning Israel into an illiberal democracy or a non-democracy, which is an Israel that not a single person in this room, I assume, would have any interest in being involved with, visiting, supporting, reading about. It'd be the kind of Israel that you sort of just cringe and look away. And it's not the kind of Israel that I think the Jewish people needs or deserves, and it's not the kind of Israel the founders tried to create. So our responsibility now is to try to do whatever we can wherever we live to prevent that.
And we're going to get to what the founders envisioned, which is your book. But before we just leave the moment, I was very struck by when you talked about being in services where you go to shul once a week and how intergenerational it was, and that it struck you not just how exquisite this moment is, but you said this may not last. The young kids in the room, who will presumably be no less educated and talented than their parents, will not stay in a country that has become an illiberal democracy. They will not stay in a country in which intolerant views of women, Arabs, non-Orthodox Jews, academic openness, intellectual creativity all feel like they are on the defensive. Can you just talk about those who are considering leaving now? You said that it's at the end of this, who's going to stay? Every meal, every conversation I have, every Saturday night, someone within earshot asks that question.
Yeah, so I think what's very interesting about this whole we're going to leave thing is that what you heard it a lot more at the beginning. And I talk to my kids, and I talk to my kids about their friends. And so I kind of get a sense, my kids are all over the map in terms of politics, religion, and all of that. So my kids are a kind of an interest, and my students, of course, at Shalem. So I get a sense of how some people were saying, my friends are going to leave, or I'm going to leave. And these people who 90 days later found themselves, the night that Yoav Gallant was fired, the defense minister was fired, found themselves on the streets at 3 o'clock in the morning, spontaneous protest, not one of the organized ones. And they, I think, discovered a sense of passion about the country in which leaving is now not on the agenda. Winning is on the agenda. Preventing the demise of liberal democracy is on the agenda. And I'll just say, I have 3 kids, but one of them was in Israel during this point only. And he's had a very interesting life. He's married to an amazing woman. He's got a kid. He's got a kid on the way. He is a lawyer. He clerked at the Supreme Court. He was a commando for 8 years. He's had a pretty interesting life. And he texted us the night of those protests, and he said it was the single most inspiring moment of his entire life. And I think that a lot of people are finding that defending the Israel that they love is much more compelling than threatening to leave. So whereas the discourse about leaving was there at the beginning, we're hearing less of it now. But that's only presuming that they win. If this goes through the way that people are afraid it's going to go through, which I don't think it will, as I said, but if it were to, then again, why would those people, I was in this, as you mentioned, I was in this synagogue. It's a minyan that I go to because it's the minyan that my Boston kids used to go to when they lived in Jerusalem. And so I keep going, hoping that my grandchildren are still there and they're going to come running out and say, Saba, Saba, we never left. But in any event, they don't do that. But it's lawyers, doctors, academics. It's one of those very typical South Jerusalem kind of minyanim, and it meets in a gym with basketball hoops and the whole shebang. And the singing was like kind of bouncing off the walls. It was reverberating. And it's what you call an egalitarian Orthodox minyan. There's a mechitza, but men and women have totally equal roles. And these are all, both the men and the women in this particular community have all been to yeshiva or seminary. They know their stuff cold, and they're doctors and lawyers and this and that. They're the top. And that's what I said. They're not going to stay if the government is going to take overtly anti-Arab, make that part of the discourse of Israeli society, if it's going to shut down academic freedom at Hebrew University, where a lot of these people teach. I don't think it's going to come to that, but I worry that it could come to that. And I just looked at this room full of unbelievable human beings who make up, to me, the very best of what Israel is. And why would they stay? And I just want to say, as a kind of an aside, we might be saying to ourselves, oh my God, that's so terrible that they would leave. But remember that a lot of people chose not to go in the first place for those exact reasons. A lot of people chose not to go in the first place because they wanted to live in first world countries. And until relatively recently, Israel wasn't a first world country. And they wanted to live in a place where a lot of the things that plague Israel don't exist. And that's why, you have a country here of 6 million people. I think every Jew has a right to live exactly where she or he wants to live. But I don't think we should go tisk that they would leave, because leaving is the same exact decision as not going. And Jews all over the world make decisions of that sort. But I don't want them to leave. I want them to love the place as much as I love the place. Right now they can. And I think our job is to make sure that they can continue to do that.
So the subtitle of your book is 75 Years After Its Creation, Has Israel Fulfilled Its Founders' Dreams? What were its founders' dreams?
The dreams were to change the existential condition of the Jewish people. The dream was to create a new Jew. The dream was to create a Jew who, contrary to Chaim Nachman Bialik's poetry, was afraid. Bialik, when he describes the victims of the pogroms and the men standing by idly while the worst possible things imaginable happened to the women in the room, Bialik says, these are the sons of the Maccabees, meaning, really? You, thousands of years ago, got rid of the Greeks or the Seleucids or whatever, and all you can do now is watch as this most unspeakable, horrible thing is happening. That's what you've become. So the dream was to, as I said before, to save the Jewish people from the Jewish religion. That didn't pan out, but it was the first phase. But it's been unbelievably successful. The goal was to create Jews who did not feel that they were living on borrowed time until the invitation in Poland, Russia, Austria, wherever it was, ran out. The invitation's not going to run out in Israel. The dream was to create a Jew who was not looking over her shoulder or his shoulder, always wondering where the next program was going to come from. We're dealing with a wave of terror now, clearly. The difference is that we can respond. There is a picture in the book which has these Jews of Hordakov after a pogrom, all wrapped in gauze, staring into the camera. What can the Jews of Hordakov do after there's a pogrom? Hope that the next one is not around the corner. That's all that they can do. And it's small consolation to the D family in Efrat, who lost 2 daughters and a wife mother last week. It's very small consolation, but we will find the person. We will find that person. And there's going to be a price to having taken that horrible step.
I want to just remember, sometimes I think we take for granted what you talk about of the tear-rinsed lives that informed the Zionist kind of idea, at least for many of the founders. You write, one cannot begin to understand the soul of the state of Israel without appreciating the fact that for many, embrace of Zionism was born of tear-rinsed lives. Jews yearned for a home of their own because their welcome everywhere else always ran out. The idea of how stark that reality was, that there was essentially no place. Can you just bring us back to kind of how existential that was? I mean, I think probably everyone in this room remembers it on some level, but certainly the younger generation, my kids don't.
Right, and that's part of the problem of Israel's success. Part of the problem of Israel's overwhelming success in changing the existential condition of the Jew is that a younger generation doesn't even remember what the existential condition had been before. It's been so overwhelmingly successful. And then the irony also is that because we don't recall what the existential condition had been, well, then it doesn't make any sense that we really need this country, when in fact we don't remember it because of this country. But look, when Chaim Nachman Bialik's 18 or 19 years old, he writes a poem called To the Bird. It's his first poem. And he basically says to a bird who's arrived to his windowsill in Eastern Europe, and he says, tell me, you've just come back from the warmer climes of the Middle East or whatever, is there a place where it's not as horrible as this? Is there a place where the souls aren't broken? He's an 18-year-old, Bialik is, and he says, my tears are all dried up. I'm done. Now, when an 18-year-old writes that kind of poetry, something's really wrong. Herzl feels a different kind of desperation. I mean, Herzl is desperate to get the Jews out of Europe, so desperate that he actually takes this very silly British offer in 1903 about possibly going to, it was really Sudan, but it was called Uganda because it was part of the Uganda Protectorate. And the Zionist Congress in 1903 blows up because it was a silly idea. The warm and fuzzies that you and I feel when we get to Israel because it's the land of our ancestors, we would not have felt in Sudan. And that the magnet that has brought Jews there as visitors or as immigrants wouldn't exist. The tragedy of Herzl's life, by the way, is that he dies in 1904 before the next Zionist Congress.
And he worries that's his legacy.
He thinks that's his legacy.
As a failure.
I blew up my own movement. But Herzl and Bialik and all the other ones, they all saw it coming. They said, I forget, this is long before Hitler writes Mein Kampf in 1922 and 1923, long before anybody had ever heard of him. They all said, this can't go on. This is going to go very, very bad. Let's get out before it's too late. And just as an aside, how complicated all of this is. Yesterday was Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, and there's always articles in the Israeli press about how a third of the Holocaust survivors living in Israel are now living under the poverty line. And you can say to yourself, I mean, that's just obscene, right? It's just obscene. How many are there? How much money would it cost to... There's no excuse for it. But you have to understand how complicated Israel's relationship with Holocaust survivors has always been, even after Eichmann trial, because people somehow say, Jabotinsky told you to get out, and Herzl told you to get out, and Chaim Nachman Bialik told you to get out. What were you doing there? Now again, that's not logical, that's not rational, that's not moral, but its feelings aren't logical or rational. And there's the conflict about the Holocaust still.
You write about that here, and when you're talking about the new Jew is one who is not a victim. Tommy Lapid, the father of the now central, Yair Lapid.
He's father of Yair Lapid, yeah.
And a survivor of the Budapest ghetto, who ultimately became a well-known Israeli journalist and successful politician, recalled that years after he'd come to Israel, how veteran members of the Yishuv, that's pre-state Israel, essentially accused the survivors for what they had endured. Why didn't you fight back, they would ask. Why did you go like sheep to the slaughter? This is the new Jew, were first-class Jews who took up arms and fought, while we were second-class Yids, whom the Germans could annihilate without encountering resistance. So it's almost like a shame, it's like a stain, and we don't want to...
We're creating a new Jew, and you're the old Jew. You are really the old Jew. You stayed too long, you got rounded up, you got slaughtered. We were here, becoming brawny and suntanned and farming by day and...
But how does that lead to not having food on the table?
Well, these people came very often broken souls. They came very often alone. They came carrying human psychological burdens that you and I can't even begin to imagine. And as you get alone, again, if your spouse dies, your children die, you don't have children around, and you're in your 90s, they don't necessarily have the wherewithal to fend for themselves and even know the system. They've remained immigrants in many ways, even 70, 75 years later. So there's nothing justifying it in the world. But they were broken souls, and they've remained very much broken souls.
So the Declaration of Independence is kind of your organizing principle in this book. And it's fascinating just because I have never taken the deep dive. But first I would venture to say, and maybe I'm wrong, that the majority of American Jews have not read that document fully. Can you just talk about why you used it kind of as a benchmark?
You can take out fully. They haven't read it. And by the way, neither have Israeli Jews. And one of the great ironies is that on these protests in Tel Aviv, where they print out these enormous copies of the Declaration of Independence, and literally like by 5 feet by 30 feet, and they lay it out on the ground, and then people line up with Sharpies to sign it. I want to sign the Declaration of Independence also as a kind of a statement of something. They, I'm not sure, are aware that earlier drafts of the Declaration of Independence had the word democracy in it, and Ben-Gurion crossed it out, and it's not in there. So it's not entirely clear to me what they think they're actually signing, but they're making a statement that this is the document that was the embodiment of our vision. And the embodiment of the vision was basically, we have always been part of this land. We've come home. We're not emigrating someplace. This is not a colonialist project, even though they don't talk about it that way. We've come home. Then there's a brief description of the horrors of Jewish exile, exilic life. Then there's a description of all that they had done in the Yishuv to build up agriculture and people working for a wage and living as normal human beings do, charting their own course. Then there's a brief mention of the Holocaust. There's a brief mention also of the Balfour Declaration. And then, of course, the United Nations vote. And then it says, basically, that the Jewish state will be conducted according to the principles of the prophets, which was what Ben-Gurion put in instead of democracy. Really, there's reasons that he want to put democracy in. We can revisit it if you want. But Now, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, the widow, the orphan, the poor, the stranger, we're going to be a moral land. And in that way, by the way, signing the Declaration of Independence is an appropriate thing to do now for the protesters, because what they're worried about in the judicial reform is that the protections for minorities, which the Supreme Court represents by virtue of judicial review and other things, those protections would evaporate. And they're right about that. So in a sense, signing the Declaration is not quite as silly as I was making it out to be unfairly. They're saying we believe in this prophetic, idealized vision. We know that no country lives up to it in every way. No country. Not the United States, not Europe, not Israel, but that's what we're about. So I chose the Declaration because, just like today, I think it was the one document that everybody more or less signed on to. The right signed on to it when the country was formed. The left signed on to it. The religious, the secular. It's the one document that we have that has attained a kind of a trans-party, trans-ideological faction status. And then the question really became in the book was, what does the Declaration say we were going to do? And how well have we done it?
And your answer?
I didn't want to give it a B+ or a C-. I wanted to say that here are the ways in which we have been really successful. And I think the ways in which we've been unbelievably successful, I first of all mentioned, is changing the existential condition of the Jew. There's not even a small-sized Israeli city that does not have a Ben Yehuda street. And that's because in reviving a language that for 1,000 whatever years nobody spoke is a miracle. The fact that literally it would not have taken much more than the main sanctuary of this building to house all the Jews in the world who spoke Hebrew, let's say in 1875, literally. They could probably all have gotten a seat in the main sanctuary. And now it's the native tongue of some 10 million people, including Jews, including Muslims, including Christians. So in that regard, it's been an overwhelming success. The Jews are not afraid anymore. They're worried, and we are not invulnerable, but we're not without defense, and we're not without protection. I could go on and on, but we've stumbled badly along the way. And, you can point to a whole array of things.
Well, let's talk about in some of the ways.
Okay, so there's obviously let's talk about the military things. I talk about it in the book. Kibia in 1956, which was a retaliatory strike on an Arab village in what's now the West Bank, but was then Jordan, where we killed dozens of innocent people. Not clear what was intended, what was not intended, but we certainly killed them. That's not in question. It was right before the October 56 war also, so tensions were heightened. But still, Sabra and Shatila, which was a turning point in American-Jewish relations with Israel, because even though Israeli soldiers didn't fire a single shot, 700 Muslims were killed by Christians as Israeli soldiers patrolled outside the camp and had to know something was going on. The shooting went on for days. Look, I think the Palestinian conflict, which is much more part of American Jewish discourse than it is part of Israeli Jewish discourse, because Israelis tragically have come to the belief that for the time being, there's just nothing that can be done to solve it. The only thing we can do is lighten our footprint, which we should do, and that's part of what Micha Goodman talks about, called shrinking in the conflict, and others. But I think that the Palestinian conflict is also, we've not handled it.
Wait, when you say lighten the footprint, you mean kind of there should be less of an assault kind of on just basic dignity.
Correct.
That is weighed constantly against security, the things that are done that make like quality of life for Palestinians so hard. But what do you...
There's something fundamentally humiliating about a checkpoint where you wait online for hours to get through, and there's this 18-year-old kid who gets to decide if you get through, don't get through, show me your papers, don't show your papers. So Micha Goodman, for example, has said, let's create roads and tunnels between the various Palestinian enclaves in the West Bank so they can go all over the place and not have to see any Israeli soldiers. How much money can it possibly cost to build those roads or those tunnels or those bridges or whatever? He's talked about investing more money in their infrastructure and their economy. I'll remind you, in the last couple of months, there's been a couple of very serious Israeli raids in Shechem, in Nablus, where we killed a whole bunch of people that were part of this thing called Gova Arayot, the Lion's Den terrorist group. If you remember, some people here do, some people here don't, but if you remember the Intifada, 2000 and 2004, raids in Shechem brought the entire city out in rage and huge gun battles and so on. That didn't happen. Why? They haven't become Zionists, but they have a very functioning economy that they do not want to see go down the drain. So investment in economy actually does bring out a certain amount of moderation, because we have nothing to lose. You have nothing to lose. If you have something to lose, you do. So there's a lot of ways of lightening our footprint. And I hope and pray, making it clear to the world and to the Palestinians that when you are ready to talk to us about something that gives dignity and security to both peoples, we're here to have that conversation. As long as Abbas is in charge, that conversation's not going to happen. He's not young. He's not going to be around forever. When the time comes that he's no longer the head of the PA, one of the critical things that we're going to have to watch and see is who do the Palestinians then get as their next leader? When Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, what if it hadn't been Hamas? What if it had been another group that had said, we want to talk to you about this. We don't want an embargo. We don't want to be surrounded, but no rockets. We want to have a different kind of a conversation. That's not what happened in the West Bank. That's what makes Israelis very afraid of pulling back in the West Bank, because if we have in the West Bank what we have in Gaza, then huge swaths of the country are within the range of those rockets. It's not going to happen so fast. But we need to make it clear to ourselves, to the world, and to the Palestinians that when there is willingness on the other side to reach an agreement, we're still there. And the longer we wait, the fewer people on either side are willing to do that. I point out in the book that more than 50% of both Israelis and Palestinians no longer believe in the two-state solution.
You write, Israel's controlling the lives, or essentially the fact that Israel is controlling the lives of another people is a moral morass that has, without question, calloused parts of Israeli society. Waging this war, even if it is a low-grade war, invariably leads to mistakes and at times terrible misdeeds. I feel like that, in a sense, was even unusual to admit. That sometimes it feels like it's untouchable to acknowledge any culpability, because then someone is accused of somehow not being Zionist anymore. And it felt like, in a sense, that was a turn that you're taking as well, is to acknowledge that there are missteps, even though you are still saying that the status quo, frankly, is the status quo for as long as the eye can see.
Right. I mean, the status quo is both intolerable and it can endure for another 50 years. I mean, I would hate to think that could happen, but it could. I don't see it. I know a lot of people are very surprised. They say, oh my God, look what Gordis is saying now. It's what I've always felt, that there ought to be a solution to this thing that gives protection, security and dignity to both sides. That's what I've always felt. I think that the voice that many people find this surprising is because for a very long time, I think I found myself trying to defend Israel to the part of the international Jewish community that felt very relentlessly critical of Israel. And the voice that I assume, maybe because I was an immigrant, maybe because I was newly falling in love with the country, maybe because, I don't know, that would be, I guess, on the couch to figure that out. But I think I felt like I had assumed this voice of, if you are this organization or that, or we're at war with Gaza, and you're lambasting us for the optics that look horrible with our F-16s and F-15s and their little rockets. So I felt the need to explain why your accusations, obviously don't mean you, but one's accusations were unfair. I think that I've gotten exhausted by that conversation, and I don't really think it's worth having, for me at least. The people are going to think what they're going to think, and now I think the important conversation is to share the magnificence of what's been built in terms of inside Israel, leaving the conflict aside, and hoping that people can balance both things that they really are frustrated by about a country and things that they love about a country. Look, most of the people that are out there lambasting Israel for, let's say, the latest conflict in Gaza, the one that was last or the next one that's coming, because there's one that's coming, there always is. What I want to say to them is, when do you think exactly America is going to solve its race problem? Exactly. That's exactly when it's going to solve it. And you don't hate America? Oh, you shouldn't. You live here. It's an amazing country in a lot of ways, and it's deeply, deeply flawed. It's deeply flawed. I know that, a lot of people are very nervous about going to Israel now because of terrorism, whatever. I'm much more scared in America. I am. I'm very worried getting on the subway, wearing a kippah, and God only knows what's going to happen. I often take off my kippah here in the subway, and I never take it off in Israel, no matter what kind of a neighborhood I'm in. So I think, this is a country that is magnificent in all sorts of ways and deeply flawed in all sorts of ways. And I think that part of being a mature person in a relationship is to understand that we don't love perfection. I mean, I do. My wife doesn't, right? But we don't love perfection, and part of what makes love is that we love the package. And what I would want to say to these people, you love what America's about. You love the vision that Thomas Jefferson, yes, a slave owner, but that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine and Madison had for a new kind of self-governance around the world. And 250 years later, it's magnificent in all sorts of amazing ways, and it's so deeply flawed and painfully flawed in other ways. And yet you don't hate this country, and you're not leaving this country, and you're not lambasting this country, because it's called love. It's called patriotism. Why can't we do the same thing with Israel? Why hold it to a standard that you would not hold this country to? And
well, just on that point, you see more and more, and particularly young Jews, are taking the overlay of racial dynamics in history here and putting it onto Israel. And you write, actually, that analogies between black people in America and Arabs in Israel are unhelpful. So why are they unhelpful?
They're unhelpful, depends on which Arabs in Israel. I won't remember what I was referring to in that particular paragraph. If it's the Palestinians, then it's not helpful because...
It's page 159, you can look.
Oh, there you go, I know exactly what's on page 159. But I remember there's a "the" in the third paragraph. But in any event, I think that if it's the Palestinians, well, then the analogy completely doesn't hold, because the Palestinians, not every single one of them, obviously, and as we've talked about before, I've had a lot of people on my past podcast who are Palestinians, and they are not necessarily at war with Israel at all. But the Palestinian people, if you believe Mahmoud Abbas, is fundamentally at war with the state of Israel. African Americans are not at war with America. They're just not. They want their fair share. They're not at war with America. So if you're talking about Palestinians, then it really doesn't fit, and it doesn't really fit. And if you're talking about Israeli Arabs, we're doing much better than we were doing a long time ago. But again, the histories here are very, very different. Israel's War of Independence between November 29th, 1947, or November 30th, 1947, the day after the UN vote, and May 14th, the day of independence, that period of 5 months was a civil war between Israeli Jews and the Arabs who are today Israeli Arabs. Again, I'm not blaming them for going to war. I'm not justifying their going to war. I'm saying that's just what it was. We were at war with the people who are now our fellow citizens. That's the irony, by the way, of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration says we call upon the Arabs living in this land to do da-da-da-da, make peace, etc., etc. So when an Israeli Arab reads the Declaration of Independence, what they see is we call out to you. They don't even feel included in the Declaration of Independence any more than they do in Hatikva, by the way, the national anthem, right? Kol od balevav pnima nefesh Yehudi homia, as long as deep in the heart and the soul of a Jew, etc. Why should an Israeli Arab justice of the Supreme Court sing that? And they don't, and I don't blame them one bit. That's a whole other conversation. But it's important to remember that we're not talking about the American War of Independence, which is 200 and whatever number of years ago. We're talking in the lifetimes of some of the people in this room. Israel was at war with the people who are now Israeli Arabs. There are people in Israel, therefore, whose parents or grandparents were killed by those people's parents or grandparents. The scars are deep, and the scars are on both sides. And therefore, just the analogy, African Americans here were never at war with America. They weren't. They were brought here very much against their will. They were treated horribly for centuries, and now they're just asking to be treated like Americans. And Israeli Arabs are asking to be treated like Americans, but there is still a piece of that which is hostile to the fundamental enterprise of Israel. Not at war with it necessarily, but conflicted about it in a very profound way, and who can blame them, which just makes the analogy not helpful. And by the way, the more that Mizrahim, Jews from the Levant, Jews from Arab lands, they already are, and the more they become even more, the majority of Israeli Jews. You and I look like the minority of Israeli Jews now. The more that's the case, then the race thing doesn't apply at all, because there's not even a difference in color. You walk into a restaurant, and sometimes you can't really tell is the person an Arab or a Mizrahi Jew. Even sometimes when you listen to their Hebrew, you can't even tell. So that there's a whole array of ways in which it doesn't work, because as I see the American experience, you really can't hold African Americans responsible for the plight that they were brought into. Israeli Arabs were offered a state by the United Nations in 1947. They turned it down and declared war. That doesn't make every Israeli Arab kid today guilty in any way whatsoever, but it makes it much, much, much more complicated than what it seems to me is a certain degree of moral clarity that applies to the African American situation.
I want to switch gears and talk about pluralism or its absence or its threat. Religion. In Israel, you have quite a bit about this. I'm just going to quote you on the chief rabbinate. You say, courage is the last word one would use to describe Israel's rabbinate. It is anti-intellectual, untouched by modernity, misogynist, corrupt, and often morally vile. So
Other than that, I think it's great. So
I'm smiling because you're not mincing words.
No.
For those of us, I am a member, I know it's a shanda here, of Central Synagogue, and there's 800 people on a Friday night praying, and to see the rhetoric from the Rabbanut saying that essentially Reform Jews are akin to Holocaust deniers, it's not so easy to swallow when we're coming over there with our buses and planes and our checks and proudly and lovingly supporting a country that where the sort of the top brass religiously actually demeans and denigrates. And it's not just the personal injury. It feels like it's just a bigger statement about who is a Jew and that we're not counted. So aside from my own Jewish therapy, it's obviously pushing Jews away in a certain way. And we're seeing that with this new government, there feels more threads of that.
Absolutely. And part of the picture of the Jews that they're pushing away are Israeli Jews, which is equally tragic. In other words, it's reprehensible what they say about Reform Jews or conservative Jews in the United States. They're the top brass in the org chart. They're not the top brass in any meaningful way in the religious life of most Israelis. They're all Haredi. The chief rabbinate is Haredi and not Zionist. The children of the chief rabbis do not go to the army. They used to, but it's a long story why the chief rabbinate morphed gradually from being a kind of modern Orthodox Zionist.
You say they're not Zionists. I thought that's changed.
Depends on how you define Zionist. Their children don't go to the army, for example. They clearly come to the ceremonies and they sit and they sing Hatikva and all of that. But they're very foreign. I mean, they're not at all like the rank and file Israelis that they are supposedly the chief brass of. They haven't gone to the university. They've never had a day of secular education. The chief rabbis, and this is not an exaggeration, have never read a book in English. I mean, we're talking about a very, very closed religious worldview, which doesn't reflect outside the Haredi world, almost any single Israeli. So while I'm deeply bothered by how people like you at Central Synagogue or here in Emanu-El feel, and I totally understand how offensive that is, I'm even more distraught by the fact that young secular Israelis who are desperately looking for a connection to Jewish life say, oh, well, if that's Judaism, then I really don't need it. But those people have the rostrum, they have the microphone, they have the podium. And so I think the damage is all across the board. It hurts the relationship with American Jews. It hurts the relationship with Israeli secular Jews who are looking for a Jewish home. But here's what I think we need to remember. There are all over Israel, there's an explosion of a reawakening of Jewish interest. And that comes in all different sorts of forms, culturally, musically, literarily, liturgically, in a whole array of ways. And in many, 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 many of those communities, first of all, they don't even know it, but they're singing Debbie Friedman melodies. I burst out laughing every time I walk by this quasi-Haredi shul, catty corner from Arab House.
And they're singing the Shabera.
I was like, oh my God, if you guys only knew, you'd be boiling your own mouths or something. I don't know what you'd be doing. But there's ways in which there's patterns here, and there's a Unatana Tokef who will live and who will die from the High Holidays liturgy that was written in Kibbutz Beit Hashita, a highly secular kibbutz that's now sung in Orthodox congregations all over Israel and in congregations of all flavors
it's from
across
Sinai.
America. And in this very sort of egalitarian Orthodox synagogue we mentioned before, you would be embraced, not just because you're a person, but because you go to Central Synagogue. And they would say that's an important part of Jewish expression in the United States. And it's great that you're here. And we want to learn more about it. So again, I think that the tragedy of the chief rabbinate is the impression that they give that that's traditional Judaism in Israel. It's mostly not. But now let me be hard on myself here and say, look, but we have to also be honest about the following thing. If early Zionism, secular Zionism, believed that what it was going to do is that it was going to save the Jewish people from the Jewish religion, it sort of did that in certain kinds of ways. It saved it from an old, different kind of Judaism. It has also spawned an ethno-nationalist, racist, repugnant kind of Judaism that I don't think represents the Judaism of a lot of people in Israel, but it is the Judaism of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and certainly Avi Maoz. And I think what's unforgivable about what Bibi did was that in order to make sure that he did not lose the election so that he cannot possibly go to jail if he's convicted in any one of the several indictments that he's now being tried for, he let those people in. And he gave them a sort of a hechsher. And he said, this is actually admissible in Israeli public political discourse, and it should be reviled. And look, some of this is about the judicial reform, but not all of it. Bibi has 34 seats in the Knesset now. That's the biggest party, Likud. According to a poll done during Pesach, if there were elections held today, the Likud would get 20 seats. It would be the third largest party, and Gantz would be the winner. My point isn't about who's going to be the next prime minister. My point is those votes in this poll did not go to Ben Gvir or to Smotrich. They didn't get sloshed around the right. They left the right. They've moved to the center, not to the left, but they've moved to the center. Meaning, I think that's a very hopeful thing, regardless of what happens in the next elections. People who voted for the Likud are disgusted. They're disgusted with the kind of Judaism that's getting a platform. They're disgusted with the way that the judicial reform is being rammed down the country's throats. There's a kind of an awakening here. Mm-hmm. What we need now is a stateswoman or a statesman to grab this, or a group of them, to grab this moment and to start a national conversation about that issue and many others that Israel has so far successfully avoided for, 75 years.
So we're going to go to questions in a second, so be ready. I just want to ask you, you touch on this question that I think, at least I was raised to ask. Isn't Israel supposed to be better? And yes, we hold it to a different standard. And you write, survival was a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. The Jews also dreamed of creating a unique society, a state that would be different because it was a Jewish state, a nation that holds itself accountable to a different set of standards. Sometimes I hear my fellow Zionists say, why are you holding Israel to a different standard than any other country? It's unrealistic, it's unfair. But you're kind of bringing us back to that idea that we have Jewish values or a Jewish idea of what a state does with its power.
And I think in some ways that we haven't talked about tonight, we've lived up to it. Israel has more nonprofits per capita than any country in the world. I mean, I think everybody loves to talk about we have more companies on the NASDAQ, except in the United States, period, not per capita, than anybody. I'm much less interested in that, even though I think it's a great thing. We have more nonprofits per capita than any country in the world.
I should point out that on your podcast, you've interviewed some of these amazing people,
right? I mean, Baderech LaHachlama, I forget how you translate it, The Road to Recovery, I think it's called, where there's all these Arabs in Gaza and in the West Bank who need very serious medical care that they cannot get in Gaza or in the West Bank, and they make arrangements with the army that the patient and usually a family member accompanying them can get across the border, get across the checkpoint. But what are they going to do when they get across the checkpoint? Call an Uber and go to Tel HaShomer Hospital? So this place has an app, and if you're the Arab or the Palestinian, you sign up, and then an Israeli picks you up. And if they don't speak Arabic and the person doesn't speak Hebrew, there's Israeli Arabs who are on the phone 24 hours a day who will do the translation on the speakerphone. And the people that I interviewed on this podcast, they're settlers from the Gush Etzion block who are the drivers. In other words, and he uses the religious kibbutz's car to do all the driving, and he drives all day long. I mean, this is one of thousands and thousands of stories. So there's a way in which we also have to remember there's a ton of stuff happening that's really Jewish, and we don't talk about it enough. And a couple of years ago, when the Man Booker International Awards finalists were announced, and there were 5 finalists, when 2 of the 5 are David Grossman and Amos Oz, of all of the countries in the world, and David Grossman wins it for a very painful book called A Horse Walks into a Barn. That's also deeply Jewish. We've revived this whole world of Jewish letters and Jewish literacy. When we see all these, kind of goofy-looking Jews, and we know there's lots of juicy-looking Jews around
Only
the world.
you can say that.
My wife will sometimes say to me, well, we may not be a pretty people, but we're a very musical people. and the explosion of culture in Israel is unbelievable. And so
you haven't even talked about Startup Nation, which is...
Right, and so in a lot of ways, we are really doing a great job. And the progress that we've made with Mizrahim is really kind of amazing. The progress that we've made with Israeli Arabs is a much better story than the story that's commonly told. And there are places where we're falling desperately. And I think fairness is about telling both sides of that. And I think, if I can just say one last sentence. One, with no subordinate clauses. The purpose of the book was to elevate the conversation about Israel, not to be mired in the mud of only conflict and the rabbinate's treatment or discussion of non-Orthodox Jews. It was to say, let's ask, why was the country founded in the first place? Not about conflict, not about non-Orthodox Jews, but about changing the existential condition of the Jews all over the world. On that level, the state's been an unmitigated success. So next week on Yom HaAtzmaut, we can be very concerned. We don't have to be proud of everything, but we should be unbelievably grateful for and proud of what's been accomplished, and we should allow ourselves the opportunity of celebrating wholeheartedly.
Thank you. All right, folks. Really concise questions. Someone over here?
I'm extremely disappointed. I thought I'd get a nuanced discussion, and I'm afraid that what I got was one side's opinion of what happened. So, for example, Abigail, I found it extremely offensive when you talked about dignity and abusing dignity. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Thank you so much. So here's the question. Daniel, are you fighting a demographic battle that you'll never win? 75% of American Jews marry non-Jews. Demographically, it's over. I mean, that's a fact. 5% of Jews in 1930.
Question.
Are you fighting specifically with regard to Mizrahim in Israel? Used to be 5%, now it's 52%.
Okay.
Do you think that the reform has a valid, before you grab the microphone, do you think the reform has a valid point because it's all Ashkenaz who are ultra-liberal appointing themselves, and the Mizrahi bitterly oppose it?
Okay, so the answer to that is I already said that I think that there is absolutely room for judicial reform in Israel. I said it here tonight, and I believe that. And I can tell you, by the way, that there are a lot of Mizrahim who are opposed to the judicial reforms in their condition, in this position now. I'm very clear in the book. I mean, the book is ridiculously clear about how the Mizrahim got the short end of the stick. I talk a lot about Ben-Gurion's basically racist attitude to the Mizrahim. And there's no question that the Mizrahi experience is not one of Israel's prouder moments until now. And I said a lot of that in the book and some of it tonight. I'll just give you guys an example of how complicated this is. So you may have seen in the papers a few weeks ago that these pilots refused to show up, they refused to train, they refused to fly, and so on and so forth. And then the Air Force started to crack down, they showed up again. And when they got back to the bases, the technicians and the armaments people and all of those people, who many of whom are Mizrahim, said to them, we don't want you here. We didn't have that luxury of saying we're not going to show up. We're not going to service the planes if we don't like it. Who gives you, Ashkenazim privileged pilots, the right to say we're not showing up? What, if you were a Likud person and Rabin was the prime minister, you wouldn't fly a mission? If you were a labor person and Shamir was the prime minister, you wouldn't fly a mission? Who the hell gives you the right? And so this is so complicated. But I think there is definitely room for judicial reform. I think judicial reform that eradicates judicial review and that gives all the power for the choosing of judges to the Knesset is unthinkable and undemocratic. I'll give you one example. According to the judicial reform, both Rothmans and Levins, both both of those plans, the Knesset, if it was passed, and there was no judicial review, could pass a law. 34 to 30, if that's all who showed up one day. You don't need 61. Any simple majority. We are closing all the mosques in Israel.
Explanation.
Now, if they pass that law today, the Supreme Court's going to rule it's an unconstitutional law. But if there is no judicial review, nothing anybody can say. Now, what they would say is, Rothman and Levin and others, they would say, yes, that's sort of true, but the next Knesset would have to reenact that law, or the law would come off the books. Well, I'm not happy with that, because the next elections aren't for 4 years. So you really want to have me live in a country where you can close all the mosques or all the Reform synagogues or all the conservative synagogues for 4 years until the next election? And by the way, how many people are going to vote on that issue as their primary issue when they have to go to the polls? They get one vote. Are they going to vote security, economics, or mosques and Reform and conservative synagogues? So the judicial reform that I am opposed to is an extreme judicial reform that at the end of the day will not serve Mizrahim well either, because in certain parts of Israeli society, including in academia and other places, they are still an unfairly treated minority, and they desperately need the Supreme Court to be able to be there to protect them. The Supreme Court does need to be roped in. I've been explicit about that in dozens of articles since this whole thing started. So I don't think it was as entirely non-nuanced as you suggested.
Over here.
Yes, please describe exactly how the Supreme Court judges are selected, elected, who makes those choices. I've heard different viewpoints. I'm sure you're the one to answer that question.
All right, I'm not going to do it in great detail because it's just it's way too complicated. There is a committee. I think I forget what the number exactly is, but the point is that there are 3 Supreme Court justices that sit on the committee, and there are 2 additional members of the bar. If you can't pass a judge into the judgeship if you're missing more than if more than 2 people are opposed. So essentially, the Supreme Court justices have a veto power over the appointment of new justices. So if you argue and you believe, as many people do, and I think not entirely incorrectly, that the Supreme Court is a bastion kind of secular, European, Ashkenazi, privileged, whatever, then the argument is that it's self-perpetuating. There are Mizrahim on the Supreme Court, there are religious people on the Supreme Court, there are Arabs on the Supreme Court, but it's not enough. The alternative that was proposed was, therefore, essentially, the Knesset is going to create a committee in which the Knesset members will be the majority, and they will appoint the judges. That's equally problematic, because in the Knesset, you already have a combination of the executive and legislative branches mixed together, and if you're also now picking the judges for the judicial branch, you basically have no checks and balances whatsoever. Don't forget, you also have a unicameral parliament, so there's no House Senate, there's no House of Commons, House of Lords, so that would be very problematic. And on my Substack, I put a link to a fascinating and really important piece by an Israeli jurisprudential scholar named Netta Barak Koren. She has written about a 42-page, it's translated into English, exceedingly detailed, but also very, very clear and non-jargony explanation of what's wrong with the current system, why it desperately needs to be changed, but why the proposed reforms go too far. So if you just go onto my Substack and you...
Well, I also would just recommend your podcast with both the pro and con interviews, which were in great detail. Yes. I'm sorry. The microphone is in the hands of...
I can speak louder.
No, we need you.
Okay. You and Yossi Klein Halevi and Mati Friedman invited American Jews and American Jewish organizations to weigh in. The conventional wisdom has always been that the Israelis don't really care what the Americans say, and the Prime Minister, in effect, said that in response to President Biden's. Why do you think that it's different now?
Can we get 2 questions at once, just because I want
Sure.
There's a lot of them, and I want to sort of hear from people. There's a woman there with her hand up.
Why doesn't Israel have a constitution, and does it even matter?
Okay.
Okay. What's for breakfast? In any event, The first question is about the letter that Yossi and Mati and I wrote. I'll speak only for me. I don't want to put words in Yossi's and Mati's mouths. We all decided to write it together. We disagreed about a lot of the wording, and we each got some of what we wanted and not all of what we wanted. This is what I wanted. I want Israel not to push this judicial reform through. I want Israel to have a national conversation about what kind of judicial reform we need, bringing all the groups together, having a cerebral, calm conversation, and then pass the reform that I think is desperately needed. In order to do that, Bibi needs a way, I argued back then, to get off the tree. He climbed up into the tree with a whole bunch of other reasons, and he needs a way to get down. When you're negotiating, ask yourself, what's the other side's victory speech? If they can't give a victory speech, there ain't no deal to be made. And I wanted him to have every possible ladder. From my perspective, just Daniel Gordis' perspective, the letter was directed at the lay leadership of several critical American Jewish organizations so they could say that our professional leadership, look, one thing you cannot say about Mati Friedman, Yossi Klein Halevi, and Daniel Gordis is that they're left-wingers, or that they are constantly inviting American Jews in. This is an instance in which it's different. These guys are saying it's different. Let's come out and say something. So it didn't work in all the instances, but it did work, for example, in the federations. And I'm told by some friends who were party to these conversations that our letter was mentioned a bunch of times as an indication that it was not anti-Israel to do this. That's all I wanted out of it. Sort of worked, sort of didn't work, like a lot of things in life. Israel doesn't have a constitution for a variety of reasons. Mostly Ben-Gurion didn't want to do it because he was afraid that the very shakily cobbled together amalgam of groups, which we still see as the issue today, would come apart if we tried to have the serious conversation that we needed to have about that. A lot of scholars also believe, very ironically, that Ben-Gurion did not want a constitution because he was afraid that the constitution would create a powerful Supreme Court, and he wanted to be able to basically do whatever he wanted to do as he was building the country. He was a democratically elected autocrat. And so he did not want to get into the business of a constitution which would, first of all, rip the country apart, and if God forbid it didn't rip the country apart, would curtail his powers. Menachem Begin, when the Likud came in 77, had the same worry. He was worried that it was going to pull the country apart. Here's what I think we know. On a certain level, it doesn't matter whether Israel ends up having a constitution or not. Israel needs to have a constitutional convention. I don't mean a bunch of people getting together in Philadelphia. What I mean is Israelis need to have the conversation about what kind of country is this? How do we maintain balance of powers? How do we right the wrongs that have been done against Mizrahim among many other groups and so on and so forth? Whether a document comes out or not, I don't know. And I think that this critically existential, frightening moment could actually become an amazing opportunity for Israel if that's the conversation that happens. That's exactly what the president is trying to make happen, and we'll see.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I live in Israel. I'm very concerned, and I wanted to ask you, we're talking a lot about the judicial reform, but there are a lot of little laws and things going on every day that are changing the face of Israel. How strong do you think this government is, and how long do you foresee it lasting?
Well, my crystal ball is, I left it in Israel, so I would know if I was there and I have my crystal ball. So I have no idea. Obviously, and the Talmud says, after the last of the biblical prophets, prophecy was given to fools and children. As you can see, I'm definitely not a child, and I'd like to not be a fool. I would not put a lot of money on the longevity of this government. I think the polls are showing, if you're a Likudnik, if you're a career Likudnik, this government is killing your party and is killing your chances for making it into the Knesset in the near future. There's a whole array of reasons it's going to take too long. I don't think this government is going to, I don't know, if it's half a year, it's a year and a half. It may be that Gantz comes to the rescue and does a national unity government with Bibi so we don't have to go to elections. That would be very statesmanlike. I don't know if he would do it or not. He doesn't consult with me. But it's very clear the government is very, very shaky, and Bibi has to be panic-stricken about this poll that just came out. He sees disaster coming. He's got to figure out a way of pulling back on the throttle of these judicial reforms in a way that doesn't alienate the Rothman, Levins of the world and get his right wing to bolt, in a way that makes the center-left protesters feel heard, and hopefully in a way that engenders the conversation that Israel needs to have.
So, Danny, I want to just end by something that I know you've talked about, which especially having just marked Yom HaShoah, this week, which is that Israel talks about going from destruction to rebirth. And so much of your book is about that thread. So can you just, on a final note, tell us how your book kind of dramatizes that idea?
I think destruction to rebirth is the story that almost all of us tell about the Jewish world today. We can be Central Synagogue, we can be Emanu-El, we can be Orthodox synagogues, and it doesn't make any difference. We tell a story of a horror that culminated in the middle of the 20th century, and at the very precipice, not really the precipice, by the way, for Polish Jewry, 90% of whom were murdered. So for Polish Jewry, I mean, Hitler won. But as the Jewish people as a whole, we came very close to the precipice. And within a very few years, we created this fledgling country, which is now an extraordinary accomplishment. And what I think is important about the question that you're asking, Abby, is this. What's at stake in the future of Israel is not only the Jewish state. What's at stake in the future of Israel is the narrative that we all have of a Jewish people that has come back from the precipice and been reborn. If, God forbid, Israel becomes an illiberal democracy or a non-democracy, which in my mind is then completely unsustainable and relatively quickly becomes a second world country and a third world country and whatever, American Jews also won't be able to tell the story that they've been telling about themselves for a very long time. So all of world Jewry has a vested interest in Israel's security and flourishing as a liberal democracy that is increasingly fair to Mizrahim, but is a liberal democracy. And we have to hope and pray that this existential moment passes without violence, that it passes with greater understanding, and that when we look back on 2023, we'll say that the crisis of Israel's 75th year was the crisis that created a constitutional conversation in Israel, which guaranteed its survival for the next 75 years.
Thank you, Daniel Gordis. Thank you all. Thank you to Gadi Levy and Erica Resnick and Ari. Thank you. And I'll see you next time.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.